We are the Center for Advancing Health Outcomes. Research that transforms care, policy, practice, lives. Visit us at advancinghealth.ca.
Hi, welcome everyone to this week's and the last of 2023 Advancing Health's Work in Progress series. Today, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Murthy, who is a clinical associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics at UBC, an investigator at BC Children's Hospital Research Institute, and a scientist at Advancing Health. His research focuses on stemming the burden of disease related to infections in children through optimizing their management of a variety of settings. Additionally, Dr. Murthy investigates the ability of healthcare systems to cost-effectively manage critically ill children, especially those with infection. So we'd like to welcome Dr. Murthy.
Thank you, Erin. Hi, everyone. Thanks. Great to be here. I think my slides work this way. So I'm going to talk for, I don't know, 30-ish minutes. I'm not sure where the camera is here. It's right there, I guess. And we're going to talk about a few things. And people who know me, I do have an ability to rant. And so I'll try to stem my ranting to a certain extent, but we'll see how it goes. So first, thank you. And also, thank you to the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Coast Salish peoples. Without them, we wouldn't have this conversation today. And I want to be eternally grateful for their gratitude. Okay, financial disclosures. I receive salary support from those organizations, the Health Research Foundation, Innovative Medicines Canada as a chair. I get research funding from CIHR and Wellcome Trust, and I receive money from CADTH for drug evaluation work. CADTH is our Canadian Agency for Drugs, Technology, and Health. I always put intellectual disclosures on slides as to where I'm coming from and sort of like the positionality of this conversation. I chair a lot of guideline panels for various clinical questions. And I think fundamentally, it boils down to we know very little about how to practice clinically. A lot of the things that we do aren't based in evidence. We all know this. And I think using that as our foundation for this conversation and how we can get to a place where we know more and have more confidence when we have conversations with patients and have conversations with policymakers about what to do and how to do it. Intellectual disclaimers. I'm trying not to make this too technical a talk. I do vouch for Bayesian statistics, and I love talking about Bayesian stats, but acknowledge that not necessarily everyone also agrees with that. So I'm not going to get into numbers. I'm not going to get into factorial and integrals and all the other things, but I will acknowledge that a lot of these principles are based in the idea that Bayesian stats or Bayesian probability theory, meaning the probability of something happening is based on the knowledge you have going into that decision. And so the dependent probabilities is a complex idea statistically, but philosophically, it actually is what we do all the time. So we're gonna sort of break things down into generating evidence, translating that into policy, and implementing that into practice. This is hard. And this is sort of what the evidence-based ecosystem tries to do. And we've done a lot of work on sort of each of those pillars and trying to figure out how to get from A to B to C, and whether any shortcuts are possible or plausible, and where the bottlenecks are in our ecosystems. Remember, our goal is to have that learning health system. And so we keep that sort of pillar in mind as we think about all of these policy objectives. What is that learning health system? Sort of a health system that learns. And so AHRQ, the American Agency for Health Research and Quality, defines it as such. A learning health system is a health system in which internal data and experience are systematically integrated with external evidence, and that knowledge is put into practice. There's a lot to unpack within that definition and how we sort of practice clinically now and how we sort of integrate policy into practice. First, there's that internal data and experience. So what you do and what you did yesterday in clinical practice, does that inform and how you can get that to inform what you do tomorrow in clinical practice and how you can do that systematically and how you integrate that with external evidence from other folks who don't have your local context and your internal data and experience. And so that external evidence ideally would be high certainty evidence with knowledge translation, knowing exactly how that external evidence applies to you and how you can learn that evidence in a thoughtful and clear way. And that last part, knowledge is put into practice, is probably the hardest part. And over the past 10, 20 years, the field of implementation science has grown where people have recognized really like that's where the rubber hits the road. We can generate evidence sometimes, but we can't always put it into practice. People always like to highlight that 20-year gap between the generation of evidence and the implementation into practice. I'm going to talk about some of those issues and why those barriers exist. And so what we recognize through some sort of empirical work and qualitative work is that you can't skip steps. You can't go straight to practice with new practices without having the evidence and without having policies that sort of support that evidence to get it into practice. You also can't skip the evidence step. Folks on the ground really have been convinced, for good reason, that high quality evidence is what's required to change practice. And so going straight to policy and saying this is what you must do doesn't really land well in terms of getting to practice. And so you really need to go evidence, policy, practice. Every talk I give, I always try and give this quote. Doug Altman, statistician, now dead. We need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons. And every single time you sort of think about a project or why it's there or a paper you're reading or anything like that, think about this and whether or not it actually advances the field and advances sort of knowledge. And then the classic Edwards Deming quote, every system is perfectly designed to get the results it gets. And so the system we have in front of us, the evidence-based ecosystem, the quote unquote learning health system that we think we have, it is the system that we've designed it to be. All of its warts and all, and whether that's the right design or not, we can talk about, but every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And then this final quote from some colleagues of mine in JAMA a couple of years ago during COVID-19, but just highlighting that US, this is American, clinical research enterprise. And I'll read it out. The clinical research enterprise is set up like a marketplace with researchers competing against each other, using the appeal of their ideas, their reputation, and their experience to convince funders and colleagues to support and recruit patients. Trials are difficult to execute, become zero-sum games, and that if a study team sets up a trial to answer one question, oftentimes there is little ability to support a second trial. And I think we all as researchers recognize this in Canada to probably reflect our truth also, where we sort of compete against each other to design questions, to get funding, to sort of convince folks that my question is more important than your question. And then that's the question that's being answered. And we sort of kick that global learning and that global learning health system down the road. And so back to that first quote, every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. I apologize if I'm starting to rant already, it's still early. So these silos that we've built between research and clinical care, where we think that clinical care is on one silo and research is in another silo, that is the system that we've designed. And that is a system that's been deliberately designed for good reason. It's a picture of Nuremberg on the left, a picture of Helsinki in the middle, and the Belmont report on the right. I'm not going to go into all of the issues related to Nuremberg, but obviously we probably all know medical experimentation happened, and a lot of attention was paid to making sure that there was appropriate ethical oversight and appropriate monitoring of human subjects research. And because of those travesties and tragedies that occurred, The Declaration of Helsinki was operationalized, where most institutions around the world mandate certain standards for research to be performed on human subjects, leading to the Belmont Report in the late 70s, which was an American-led initiative, which sort of overlaid the ethical principles and guidelines for the protections of human subjects of research. This isn't an ethics talk, but it is a talk meant to sort of center some of the issues that these reports and these problems have brought out, namely the separation of research from clinical care, and with a deliberate process to make sure that those silos have their own bodies for oversight. Clinical care is governed by colleges, by clinical regulatory authorities, and research is governed by research ethics boards and institutions and so on. And that schism and that continued sort of chasm as time went on has led to these silos being more siloed in a way. Can we bridge that without overlooking the challenges that have been there for the past 80 years in human subjects research? So we'll talk about it. We'll also talk about a second problem, and this is sort of the problem of our own accord in academics. These are the number of papers in PubMed over the past number of years. It's grown quite a bit. There are a lot of papers out there. People like publishing papers. People want you to publish papers, and academics want you to publish papers, and that's kind of the coin of the realm. Is that a good thing? Not necessarily. You go back to Doug Altman's quote, we need less research, good research, and research done for the right reasons. And quantity does not necessarily equate to quality. And so when we sort of have these perverse incentives, we set up a system designed to get the results that it ultimately gets. Okay, shifting gears. So this talk was mostly centered around what a new, not reasonably new research methodology called the platform trial. And we've been working on this for the past 10 years or so in various contexts. What it studies is a population, not an intervention. It's not a specific question, does drug A work in population B? It studies a population, namely what makes this population better. It's sort of a subset within the randomized controlled trial world, where you have all randomization and all randomized controlled trials, you have master protocols, which are sort of singular protocols that exist for a number of different conditions. We have adaptive trials, and if you merge all those things together, we get these ideas called adaptive platform trials. So what are they? Instead of does X work for Y to improve outcomes, we care about what works for Y to improve outcomes. You have a population with a high degree of disease burden or high risk, and you try to make that population better. You don't know what's going to make that population better, so you need to test multiple things, sometimes in combination, but you look at all of those things to see what works and what doesn't work. From an adaptive perspective, there's all sorts of ways that this system could work. And so usual adaptive trials, you begin your data collection, you analyze your data. If you stop, you continue to revise randomization rules per an algorithm, you continue data collection. You sort of go in this perpetual fashion where you're constantly studying things and constantly adapting things. I'm going to bring it back to the learning health system in just a bit, don't worry. But I'll talk about one of the trials that we're doing. This is a work in progress talk, and so I'll have to sort of mention one trial that we've been working on for the past 10 years or so now. It's a remap, and the remap is a brand or a term that's sort of meant to connotate that adaptive platform component. Randomized, embedded, multifactorial, adaptive, and platform. And we'll talk about what those adaptations are in the next few minutes. It's funded, these are the funders, CIHR included. Thank you to all of our funders who keep this moving. And as this reflects, this is a global initiative. So traditional randomized trials take serial testing of single hypotheses. Say I have 3 questions in this population of people with pneumonia. I want to see which antibiotic works. I want to see if there's a macrolide that works for duration. I want to see if steroids work. Traditionally, I would test them one at a time, ask for funding for the first, answer the question, maybe get it right, ask for funding for the second, maybe answer the question, ask for funding for the third. I won't really learn much about how those interventions interact with each other. And obviously, it'll take a long time, and it'll be reasonably inefficient. If I were to do all of those things at the same time, checking antibiotics, macrolide duration, steroid use simultaneously, so that I can test for interactions between them, and then have that learning system. And so I'm constantly adapting which antibiotic I test, which steroid use regimen I care about, and which macrolide duration is the best and most important. You can adapt and generate, in some ways, a learning system. We'll talk about adaptive randomization in just a slide or two. So I apologize for the font and the formatting. This is generated. Our first patient was recruited back in 2017, sort of before the pandemic. This is for community-acquired pneumonia. We had three initial goals, primarily. First, to identify evidence gaps and evaluate them. Two, to build out an international collaboration and capacity building for investigator-initiated trials, and then rapidly switch to pandemic recruitment if a future pandemic emerged. And unfortunately, one did in 2020. And since then, we've recruited 18,000 patients. And these are sort of results. I'm not going to go into each of those individually, but lots of different interventions tested and lots of different interventions found ineffective and a few found effective, and testing across a variety of sites across the world. In the back end, this is exceptionally complicated. And the front end, not so much, but the back end of the databases and the data flows for things like this, when you're testing dozens of different things simultaneously, one can envision the database infrastructure for something like that to be somewhat overwhelming. So it's taken a lot of work, and hence 2017 was our first patient, and trying to get all of this operational and trying to get this off the ground. And these are various arrows about where patient data flows and different things. And this is just one slide to highlight some of the complexities here. But back to that platform trial idea. And so what this design works on is it takes a population, say that green, pink, and yellow people, looks at standard of care, intervention 1, intervention 2, analyzes, says, say, intervention 1, not good, drop that, add in a new intervention, that's intervention 3. So you're testing now standard of care, intervention 2 and intervention 3, check again, get a new arm introduced, intervention 4, and so on and so on and so forth. So you drop arms, you add arms, you shift allocation to different arms depending on which arm is doing better at various interim analysis. And we'll talk about how that intersects with learning health system ideas in a second. So this sort of population where you're constantly looking at things to see if they work or if they don't work, gradually pushes that population to do better. Slowly over time, as new knowledge is generated, if you're involved with the trial, in theory, you'll be getting the highest quality care. Embedded. So we'll talk about this embedded idea, which is probably the hardest thing to operationalize, particularly across care settings. And we've written about this in a variety of different places, in the US health system, in a Japanese health system, in a Nepalese health system, about the lessons learned about embedding research within clinical care. And every system has its challenges here. I remember going back to this learning health system definition, in which internal data and experience are systematically integrated with external evidence, and that knowledge is put into practice. And so we all recognize that we need to embed data and knowledge generation into clinical care. Back to this sort of complex learning health system schematic about all of these complex ideas that go into how data, knowledge, and practice intersect. So what did we learn? And we've done a bunch of qualitative interviews across different health settings, including Canada, about how one can better embed clinical research within clinical care to get that knowledge generation across the health system. The first thing is that consent within the clinical encounter was highlighted as an important idea. And so the patient who talks to the doctor or the nurse or the clinician who's taking care of them, that consent happens within that conversation rather than a separate researcher-led conversation. And that's a tricky concept from a Belmont report type idea, where there is a church and state type distinction between research and care. And can clinicians seek out consent from their individual patients? And does that provide undue influence? Does that coerce them? All of these complex ideas inevitably emerge. And it goes back to why we do clinical research. And traditionally, if it's a drug company sponsored study, there may be some financial incentives. If there's institutional incentives and all these other things, that may lead to more complex ideas of coercion and influence. But if there's not, if it's purely that you don't know what the right answer is to do for the patient you have in front of you, and randomization is the best way of getting the answer, then consent within that clinical encounter is okay. From a TCPS and other standard. And so thinking about how that works across the health system in different health scenarios is important. Randomization and intervention within the health IT infrastructure. And the folks in Pittsburgh were really great, and different hospitals across our health systems across the United States have great infrastructure, are working towards great infrastructure for this exact thing, where everything is within the health IT infrastructure. It's not a separate database. It's within whatever system you are using in your hospital, that the randomization allocation is there. The allocation of the intervention is embedded within the order set. And so you get randomized and your intervention is then directly produced in front of you without 400 different steps or 400 different clicks. And it's part of clinical care within that health IT infrastructure. Canadian health IT is, as everyone knows, has its challenges, and so it's a hard one to sell here. Data from routinely collected sources. And so we have so much health data on every single person who intersects with the health system, and we use it not in an efficient way, and we use it in a way that doesn't necessarily reflect what patients want us to use it for. And there's been all sorts of both qualitative and quantitative work about what patients want their data to be used for. And they are okay, by and large, with it being used to improve the care of patients, of themselves and patients around them. But the infrastructure isn't necessarily set up for that. And so we need to think about how we generate data from that routinely collected sources and be able to integrate it within that learning system. And that data needs to be rapidly accessible and to leave the health IT world for analysis and reporting and sharing. That's tricky. And that requires certain privacy impact approaches and various different thoughts about who owns that data and data oversight and all the movement towards open data within clinical trials and so on. There are a lot of barriers for that last point, but a lot of them are technical, and a lot of them can be solved with the right momentum and political will. Oh, here we go. Other barriers, the governance of research versus the governance of care. And so a lot of the interviews that we've done have shown that governance of research is under one pocket and the governance of care is under another. And that makes it hard to merge those two systems together. Data access, data quality, we talked about. Regulatory and REB requirements, we talked about. The regulatory requirements especially are tricky when implementing and embedding research within care, particularly if it's a regulated study of any sort, where there needs to be 400 signatures for every single thing that happens. And that is not necessarily conducive to easy embedded research. And then things like intellectual property and who owns the research and so on are always complex when the data is within the health system, but overcomable. Facilitators are really like, the patients want this and clinicians want this. And I think you can't underestimate how important that idea is when patients want improved care. And this is sort of a pathway to get there. And clinicians want it to be easier to do this stuff and improve the care of the patient they see tomorrow based on information that they can generate yesterday. And so trying to intersect those things is work that many people are doing. Adaptive, that adaptive component of the A is something that is, from a trialist perspective, I don't want to get into so much about like alpha spending and so on, but we'll talk about one specific idea, which is this idea of response adaptive randomization. This is data on vitamin C, for example, that we published recently. How if you are in a trial, the intervention that you are allocated is dependent on how well that intervention is doing over the course of the trial. And so in principle, if you are in the trial, you are going to do better clinically by definition than if you are not within the trial. And it takes a while for people to wrap their head around that idea because it's somewhat tricky to appreciate the statistical approaches that RAR leads to, because it does lead to less power within your trial. It can anyway. It can also lead to more sort of confusing statements because the consent conversation is slightly different, meaning your allocation is dependent on how patients did in the trial last week or last month or last year. And so you will inform how patients do in 6 months and 12 months and so on. And so will you, because you're participating in this trial, do worse than patients participating in 12 months? Possibly. And that's part of that idea of that learning health system where you're constantly improving things so that you can eventually make things better. We have a system here for this trial where if something is better, it will be 100% allocated in the response adaptive randomization. So if we've proven something is unequivocally better than the other thing, and that is automatically integrated into the randomization, and so that it's automatically implemented into care for patients participating in that trial. And so that pathway between evidence generation and evidence implementation is all integrated within one ecosystem in a way. Like I said, if something is effective, it goes all the way to 100%. If it's not effective, it goes to 0%. And so you will not get it. And so in theory, it's a direct pathway for integrating effective interventions into clinical care. And we've done some surveys that said like, patients seem to like this and will more preferentially participate in research if they know that they're going to get possibly more benefit from it. But it does lead to sort of statistical questions that we don't need to get into now that have made it somewhat of a hard sell in different contexts. The last thing I'll talk about for this specific trial is the multifactorial aspect of things. I work in the ICU. I make about, or anyone in the ICU makes dozens of decisions every minute or every hour about every single individual patient. I don't necessarily know which decision impacts another decision, but testing one intervention at a time is not necessarily an efficient way to generate that learning health system. So this is like our trial. This is the number of domains, the number of randomizations that participants are randomized to per month. And back in September of 2020, you see a couple of 6s and 7s, meaning that an individual patient was randomized 7 times during their intensive care unit stay. And so we learned a lot from that individual patient about what makes things better and what doesn't make things better, and in an efficient way, and how those multiple interventions would interact with each other. So in a way, if you have this idea of embedded multifactorial randomization with response adaptive randomization, and if you scale it out across all patients and you stratify it by important characteristics, patient disease, etc., and then you generate the common outcomes of collective importance all within a health system across multiple hospitals, in a way that meets that definition of a learning health system where you have internal data and experience systematically integrated with external evidence, and that knowledge is automatically put into practice. No one's done this yet. And it's very hard to get to this place where you can sort of have randomization as the learning within a learning health system and have that constantly be present and shift that framework between random care to randomized care. Random care being a lot of what we do right now. And so that learning health system schematic where we have data, evidence, and practice, and we have research informing that on the outside, I kind of want to reverse that, meaning research needs to be within that data, evidence, and practice circle, where you're generating data and informing practice with research that's constantly happening and sort of pushing in at every single data, evidence, and practice phase of things. The challenge is we don't really know what research is. I made a meme. I made this morning. I was very proud of that. In that, like, we ask our research ethics boards, is this research? No, it's quality improvement. And then we say, is this quality improvement? No, it's research. And that distinction is kind of, in my mind, not that useful a distinction, in that it's all trying to make things better for patients. The question is there risks or is there harms or benefits, which is a separate question than is if something is research or quality improvement. There's lots of risky quality improvement initiatives that we don't actually know if they're actually going to be useful or not. There's research that has zero risk, but needs to fall under the oversight of the ethics boards and so on. And so, like, this distinction, this, like, once again, church and state line that we've separated between research and quality improvements is sort of the part of the challenge of trying to integrate all of these things together. I always want to highlight some friends of mine from Vanderbilt who are doing this within their health system incredibly. And so they have a system where they're able to generate all of the things we talk about, namely data within that health system, incorporate patient perspectives, randomize within the health system, randomize within the health IT infrastructure, all within one large American health system where they see thousands of patients. And in the past 4 years, they've decided we're going to look at the period of intubation of a patient and ask all of the questions that come up within that complex patient encounter. And so simple questions: what type of laryngoscope to use, what drugs to use, whether to use a stylet, whether to use a bougie, whether to give fluids, whether to give isotopes, all these very simple questions that everybody asks all the time about their patients, they've randomized. And they have high impact publications and are changing practice all the time, just based on one health system being committed to doing this within the health system and using all of the data that we generate from patients and randomizing at every single opportunity within clinical care. It's hard, but it takes that political will from that leadership. And they have a very supportive CEO, they have a very supportive institution to sort of build this process across that big medical campus. So back to that evidence, policy, practice framework. We have to generate the evidence before pushing it to policy, before pushing it to practice. And the hardest thing about implementation science is not having the evidence to inform the no one's running, okay. To generate the evidence to inform the policy, to inform the practice. And I've seen more implementation science programs sort of die on a vine without having the evidence to inform those implementation programs. And so really making sure we have thoughtful evidence generation as the foundation for all of this. I'm going to end soon with a quote from Donald Rumsfeld, for what it's worth, that there are no knowns, things that we know. And that's in clinical practice, there's a handful of things that are there, things we know. We also know there are known unknowns. And these are all the things we're trying to ask clinical questions and research questions about. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know. And this is like where, like, grants are written and everyone wants to answer specific questions. The challenge is, but there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know. And that speaks to sort of the humility that we need in clinical practice to recognize that we don't know a lot. And we need to sort of embrace these ideas of trying to replace the random care we provide with randomization so that we can truly generate that learning that we need. And once again, apologies for having Donald Rumsfeld on your screen right now. So I'm going to end there after a 35-minute talk, which is always a good time. Trials are hard. They're expensive and they're laborious, but they don't really need to be. And we sort of have made these made them harder than we need to be. We need to replace the random care that we provide with randomized care to get that learning health system, and integrating an implementation arm within that randomization. And that speaks to how adaptive platform trials could be a model for that learning health system approach. And once again, to do it within the health system, not the research system. And that's a controversial statement, but something that I think if we embrace within healthcare, can make our learning systems that much stronger. I'll stop there. I'm happy to have some questions and conversation after a short talk.